If you're new to React development or you've started learning within the last few years, this video is for you. Now I have a hunch, a feeling, a guess that there's this particular fundamental part of React development that you just don't understand. And it's either been a source of pain and confusion for you, or you've just accepted what you've been told and tried not to question it. Well, I'm here today to ask it on your behalf and maybe clear up that confusion, or maybe make you even more confused. And that question is, why is useEffect so weird? I touch on this issue briefly in a separate video where I discuss my love of hooks, where I mention that useEffect can be really confusing at face value. There are a few key uses of it. You do something when a component first renders, like setting up a listener. You do something in response to a value changing, like updating that listener. Or you do something when a component is about to leave the page, like getting rid of that listener entirely. These are three common goals when developing interactions with a React app, and it's good that the library gives us a way to do these things, but why are they all wrapped up in a single hook, and why is the API so goddamn complex? For a refresher, the way you use the useEffect hook is very simple. You simply give it a function, and you give it an array of dependencies. Side note, that array is optional. What? We'll come back to that. Now, the function you pass into the useEffect call can do anything, like define more functions, even async ones, and inspect the DOM or manipulate the DOM, and add or remove event listeners, or even create new tags entirely. The one thing you can't do inside of a useEffect callback, however, is call another hook, and I will not explain that. This function also has a return signature, that is a function that gets called both when the component is about to leave the virtual DOM, and also when one of the dependencies, if provided, updates. That latter function that you return from the body of the first function is also optional. Simple, right? You got all that? Now recite it back to me. Perfect. Video over. No more confusion about useEffect. In all seriousness, I think it's kind of a confusing API for new developers. Given that useEffect is such a fundamental part of the library, if you were lost in any of that previous section, I don't blame you. And if you're not lost, I think it might just be because you've learned off those facts by heart without necessarily understanding why any of them are true. As I said earlier, there are three main uses for this hook. So why can't there just be one hook for each? Like a useOnMount hook that runs at the start of a component's life, or useOnUnMount hook that runs at the end. These are both actually hooks that I've included in my LocalBoast library, by the way. Links below if you want to see what those implementations would actually look like. I sense a lot of confusion in you, and honestly, good. I'm kind of trying to make you confused to make this video more relevant. So here's my pitch, and call me crazy if you like, but you know the old, outdated, legacy, never to be used in modern React system of class components? Well, if you don't, then perfect, I'm about to explain it. I think you should learn that first. Now don't click away just yet. You don't need to learn much about it, maybe just go through a tutorial or two, but I genuinely think that it's pretty much impossible to understand how functional components and hooks work if you don't first have a basic understanding of what came before it. Because going back to the weirdness of useEffect, it is the way it is because each of those three use cases I keep mentioning used to exist as standalone methods on class components. Back when I had a salary, I used to have to conduct a lot of interviews, and one of the questions I liked asking people was if they had experience using class components and if they could compare them to functional components. This was partly just regular interview things of trying to see if they could show off some mad passion and rant about the nuances of React unfiltered for a while, but it was also just my own fascination. Like, what is the experience of a new developer trying to learn React in 2023? Because I started learning React in 2017, so I had years of experience with class components before hooks were even introduced. Thus, I don't really know what it's like for someone starting off fresh with the current tools. I have to imagine that hooks, and particularly effects, are pretty baffling for the first while. Like one function that can be called in no fewer than 3 different ways to perform 3 distinct and key pieces of functionality, and you're just adding arrays here and there without really knowing why. Now, I will rant for hours about how pointless a lot of the stuff that I was taught in university was, but one of the things that I've always come back around on was the fact that we weren't really taught much immediately useful stuff for the first few years. Our entire first year pretty much was spent learning C, and then pretty much our entire second year was on Java. After graduating my 4-year computer science course, I had no JavaScript or HTML experience, and any other languages that might be more useful in a career like Python or C#. They were either learned as electives or as part of personal projects. Meanwhile, I had a friend in a marketing course who was using JavaScript since his first year. At the time, I was really frustrated by this, thinking the university had let me down in preparing me for a real career in engineering. But I've since realized that while not a perfect implementation, taking the time to teach us these most bare bones version of programming through C and even a little bit of assembly code, to then pivot us onto Java, giving us a clear understanding of object-oriented programming, which we then used as the basis for learning some more arguably complex things like C++ and Ruby. It gave us a much better foundation for understanding than someone who dove right into an immediately useful language. Like sure, at the time of graduating, my friend in the marketing degree could probably string together some half-decent JavaScript, but he probably wouldn't have more than a shallow understanding of what he's using. He may never have touched a class definition, and to him, an object was probably just those curly brackets you put stuff in. What I'm getting at is, while you will probably never need to know how to write or even work with class components in React, I think you're starting from unstable foundations if you try to learn functional components without first knowing about class components. I touch on this in my hooks video, but while class components were problematic in terms of reusability and bloat, they were just so clear and understandable. I still use terms like lifecycle and mount when talking about React components, even though they aren't even terms associated with React anymore. Googling the term React lifecycle or React mount takes you to legacy pages about class components, but I think the lifecycle is still so important. And in my mind, when I'm writing a functional component, I still have a clear visual in my mind of the steps that a component goes through when rendering, regardless of whether it's a class component or a functional component. Now there are a bunch of diagrams that basically say the same thing if you Google React lifecycle diagram, but basically it goes like this. Some component creates it as a child. Its render function gets called to output a React node to the page. It announces that it's been mounted, and now it's in the virtual DOM. When its parent re-renders, it re-renders unless specified that shouldn't happen. After re-rendering, it announces that it's finished updating, and we can see if some value has changed from the previous render, when the parent component no longer includes it as a child, or if the parent component doesn't even exist anymore, like if the page unloads, it no longer is in the DOM, and so the component has a chance to do something to clean up after itself. I don't know why this lifecycle isn't talked about with React anymore. It may just be a technical under-the-hood distinguisher, like functional components don't mount, they're called and then they go away. Getting hung up on technicalities like that is fine for the core team building the React library, but for you and me, having this lifecycle in our minds can help so much with structuring how these components come into existence, linger on our page, and then come out of existence. As someone who learned class components, then transitioned to using functional components, I found that transition really clear because I could more or less map one-to-one from class components, where they were really easy to understand, to functional components, where they were more compact. Let's look at our steps from earlier again. With the component getting created, in class components, you had a dedicated constructor function where you could set the initial state and attach callbacks to it. With functional components, there is no constructor hook equivalent, but each of the relevant hooks like useState, useRef, and useMemo allow you to provide a default value. So this is effectively the same thing as a constructor method where you're setting up the data sources once at the very beginning, and these provided arguments just aren't used again for the rest of the lifecycle. 2. The render function gets called. With class components, this is really simple. Class components have a dedicated render function. It's a literal function that gets called, and based on the data available to the class at the time, it outputs some JSX. With functional components, it's kind of weird, because the entire component is the render function. From start to finish, the definition of your component is the render function getting called in full when the component renders. So whatever is returned from this is your returned JSX. 3. When the component announces that it's been mounted. Again, mounting is a term seemingly only used with class components, but I'm just going to keep using it. I'm saying it to mean that it's been rendered and it's in the virtual DOM. So with class components, there's a really clear component did mount lifecycle method, which is called once and only once after the component first renders, giving you an asynchronous way to do stuff like set up listeners for elements on the page. With functional components, the idea of having something that needs to be done at a particular time in the component's life, but that doesn't interfere with the render process, is called an effect. We don't want to do these things in the main render function, since the render function is supposed to be pure. So you can call it as many times as React decides and it won't change anything. Since all effects share this idea of firing asynchronously, they're all done within the useEffect hook. UseEffect is written to be optimized or controlled so that the effect will only run at certain times, so it gets a special dependencies array, which is what allows us to tell React when we want the effect to run. run once when the component first mounts, and only run again if one of these things changes. So in the case of running after the component mounts and never again, we can simply add a useEffect with an empty dependencies array. And note, I'm saying an empty array. We can't just omit the array because that'll do something else that we'll cover later. Now React will run this effect after the very first render, and it will only run it again if one of the dependencies changes. And since we have no dependencies, it'll never run again, and thus here we have our equivalent of the component did mount. 4. Re-rendering is the same as the previous render cycle, where in the case of class components, it just uses the render function, and in the case of functional components, it uses the full body of the component. But there's an extra point in here, in both cases, where you can optimize it to avoid unneeded renders. For class components, this can be done by extending the pure component class instead of the regular component class. This just tells React that each time it's about to render, just see if the props have changed, and if not, don't bother. Just use the result of the previous render and skip any lifecycle methods running. In functional components, you get the equivalent by wrapping the function in a call to memo, which similarly tells React not to rerun our function if the props haven't changed. And it even lets you customize which props have to change in what way to trigger a new render and a new run of the effects. 5. After rendering. In class components, we've got a dedicated component did update lifecycle method. It's nice and clear. It's called when the component renders, and it lets you respond to changes in props and state. In functional components, you again have to use the useEffect hook. Since each time the function renders, it'll consider what effects need to be rerun. This is where we can do our special changes depending on which dependencies in our effects have changed. We can either give it a dependency array that has one or more values that might change between renders, letting us respond to these changes, or we could just not provide a dependencies array at all, and this will mean that after every render, our effect will run. In this effect, we can do things like setting up subscriptions, change the appearance of DOM elements, etc. And if we've subscribed to something or set up a listener, we can tell React how to unsubscribe, but more on that later. Lastly, when a component is being removed from the page, i.e. unmounting, in class components, we've got a really clear component will unmount lifecycle method, letting us clear up subscriptions or put things back to the way they were before we mounted. In functional components, you've again got an effect running outside of the render loop, so it again has to go into a useEffect. But remember when I mentioned clearing up our subscriptions before? Well, useEffect is designed with this in mind, with the idea that if you're creating a change or subscription in a useEffect call, it needs to be able to designate what to do after, when we no longer want that effect. Since we don't want a load of lingering subscriptions, each time we run the body of an effect, React attempts to run the function returned from the previous call of that effect, if there is one. It also does this when a component unmounts, so you can think of the function that you pass to a useEffect sort of like an instruction of how to do some stuff, and also how to undo that same stuff. Through this, by having a useEffect with an empty dependencies array, we can just return a function from our effect body, which will be run when the component unmounts, giving us a direct equivalent of component will unmount, but allowing it to be done from a single useEffect function, which now does the jobs of at least 3 different lifecycle methods all in one. So that was a lot, wasn't it? I don't want this channel to be too much of a textbook explanation of stuff with React, but here I felt that it was necessary to explain what happens in my mind when I'm writing components. Hopefully, if nothing else, I've shown that all this condensed awkwardness within functional components, while difficult to grasp at face value, can be much more easily understood if seen through the lens of the now outdated idea of a component lifecycle. I'd be genuinely interested to know if what I've said has resonated with any of you, or if you think I'm dead wrong, preaching like an old madman about how the old ways were better. But yeah, still learn React hooks. Hooks are great, and you should exclusively use functional components with hooks from now on. I don't want to hear that any of you have gone off and started exclusively using class components after hearing me talk about how great they are. They are old and they're outdated. Just do yourself a favor of taking a quick look at how they work. I think it'll make everything a bit clearer in your mind. Either way though, remember to keep making the web more interesting with everything you build, and don't be afraid to boast about it.